And so as we get ready to go into this evening, I do want to say that this has been an extraordinary effort on the parts of so many people. We started out a couple of weeks ago looking at how the church responds to crisis or in the midst of crisis. And we as people in churches need to know, people of faith need to know to help get one another through a global pandemic, to get each other through crisis. And so people who have already done that, people who we know went through that struggle. We look to MCC, who led the charge against the world as we went through the AIDS pandemic in the 80s. And so we talked with folks like the Reverend Elder Cecilia Eggleston, who is our global moderator, and the Reverend Elder Dr. Nancy Wilson, who is the immediate former moderator of Metropolitan Community Churches, and Reverend Jim Matulski, the Reverend Karen Ziegler, Reverend Steve Peters, Reverend Jimmy Gibbs, Reverend Ken South, who was the executive director of the AIDS National Interfaith Network, and the Reverend Kamendu from Matito Ande, Kenya, this afternoon, to see just how we can come together today, how we can come together and stand in the gap to share hope and to be there with one another in the midst of what is now a global crisis. How can we be there for one another? So I invite you to join us in this call this afternoon or this evening. Join us as you watch that call. Ask questions. We have folks who are monitoring the feeds and can answer questions for you or get you resources if you're looking for resources. Join us and let us know your thoughts. If you have a few moments to share and want to give us a call, do that, and we'll get you on the next call that we're going to have. If you want to share with us what your community of faith is doing, let us know that. Together we get through this crisis. Together we spread hope. Together we share love. And especially in this Easter season, I remind us that we are a resurrection people. Look towards hope. Look beyond the grave. Look beyond the cross. Look to resurrection morning and the hope and the life that is given there. Join us now as we watch this call. We've just opened it up to broadcast, so it should start allowing folks in. So we'll give folks a few moments to get logged in that wanted to join the Zoom call. We are going to, this is recording, and so we're going to air it live on Facebook at 7 p.m. Eastern Time tonight. So
people can log in. I got to tell Randa, she can log into the Zoom call then? Is that?
Yeah, they can log into the Zoom call right now, absolutely.
Okay.
And then we'll play it through Facebook Live. That way we can interact with people. Last week when we did it, we couldn't interact with the Facebook Live audience because we didn't have that running in here where we could see that.
I can.
Hi, hey Steve, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you? Do you all know Ken South?
Hello, Ken.
Hello.
Ken was the executive director of the AIDS National Interfaith Network, of which Don Eastman and I were founding board members.
And Vance, to get my email, I figured out how to get on.
Oh, good.
Obviously, I made it.
Good. I'm glad you did. Thank you for taking time to be with us, Reverend South. We certainly appreciate that.
Oh, sure. This is exciting.
We'll give folks a few more moments to log in. What we did a couple of weeks ago, we started this conversation. Several things started circulating around the same time coronavirus was becoming a really big pandemic. And folks were saying that church or pastors in particular may not know how to lead church through crisis, and asking folks to be patient with their pastors. And so that got me thinking, well, certainly that I fit that bill. I haven't led a church through crisis before, but when we look at MCC in our history, there are certainly many people who helped lead a church through crisis during the AIDS pandemic. And so we wanted to create this group that could continue a conversation to help us take the experiences from then, apply to today, and help us get through today. And then also maybe help us for the future and what that looks like. And so this is a part of I believe, what will be a much larger ongoing conversation. I've been in communication with Reverend Ziegler and Reverend Matulski today, just a few hours ago, about
having a very specifically focused political conversation and how politics plays in this as well. And so
Right.
we'll hit some of that today, and then we're going to get deeper into that on another call in the future. So thank you all for taking time to be here. We've got a couple of other panelists that may be joining us, but we can go ahead and get started if y'all would like to do that. And like I said, this is recording, so we'll send it over to Facebook after this call, and that will air live tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern time if anybody wants to log in and watch that and respond to questions that may come up during that time as well. Sure we're recording. So Reverend Sal, thank you for joining us. I think you were recommended by, I believe, Reverend Peters recommended us getting you on the call. So thank you for joining us. A lot changed since we talked last. We've got now worldwide 1,300,000 cases of confirmed coronavirus with nearly 80,000 deaths worldwide that have been confirmed. And so this is, continuing to do what I guess the scientists have told us that it was going to do, and continuing to impact every country in the world. And so none of us is exempt from this. I guess to start out with, what challenges have we seen in the last few weeks that weren't present when we talked last? This is the first time I've ever had a group of pastors and nobody
I think this is Nancy. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think since you had your broadcast was when we heard 100 to 200,000 deaths in the United States, if I'm not mistaken, that was just on the brink, kind of hearing a lot more about what is going to happen. And I think how long and the, how much it ranges from, I've heard everything from, a few months to 3 years of continuous waves of the virus. And I think in how much this is going to permanently change our lives, I think is the other thing. Maybe the way in AIDS, we didn't really know at first, that 20, 30 or more years later, we'd still be struggling or having issues. But I think that the time trajectory, the intensity, the clear way in which the United States didn't get off at all to the right, because of our politics, because of our leaders. And I think just the intensity of New York and African Americans being so disproportionately impacted. I don't know if people saw Charles Blow had an editorial in the New York Times on Monday that was the most incredible, saying it isn't an equal opportunity virus, that it really impacts people of color, especially African Americans and poor people, so much more, and just how unprepared we are in terms of having a public health system that works for everyone, and how we are different from every other developed nation in the world in that way. So I think I'm clearer, those of us from the U.S.
No, and I'm sorry to cut across you. It was one of the conversation last time for me was fascinating, and I took copious notes, and at the end of the call, I just talked about how uplifting it had been to listen to you all, because the times in which you were ministering were so stark, and we feel that now, but the resilience that you talked about, and the blessings that we heard from the stories that you gave were amazing. But one of the things that you said, Reverend Karen, was about which lives mattered, and that, HIV, targeting certain populations, and those were lives that didn't matter to the establishment, and that was very much one of the things that I took away from our conversation last time. It's okay, well, which are the lives that are going to be shown not to matter this time? And so when the reports started coming out about this disproportionately affecting African Americans, and then reading how it's going to affect areas where there's dense populations without running water. So, how can you keep your hands clean? How can you keep your distance when you're living in a highly populated area where there's 25 people to a toilet, or more? So I think for me, that's is starting to show now, which lives matter and which ones are going to be more affected.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, that's a very stark thing that's come into focus.
Yeah, thank you. I am so with both of you, what you just said. And I just want to add that since we last talked, it's become even more clear that to this administration and his political party, no lives matter. I think that also the incompetence and, the incompetence is even clearer. The corruption is even clearer. And it's even clear that that's not likely to get better or change. And then this week, the tremendous blow that not only do we not have an administration that is acting in good faith or a Congress that can hold him accountable, but we now don't have a Supreme Court, clearly. So all of that has happened since we last spoke.
Yeah. And I think that about the Charles Blow article in the New York Times this week said that social distancing is a privilege, and connecting the privilege of being able to even do social or physical distancing is so powerful. And I do think, Karen, yes, you're right about the alarming collapse. What's going to happen with our elections? That we are in a time now of immense uncertainty.
Yes.
And this is, and that's disadvantaging at the moment. I think democratic issues and possibilities, and just, and that we can't gather and protest, that can't happen. So how do we exert our political power, and then when voting is even more endangered. I mean, it already was, but now, like you said, with the Supreme Court, is just so alarming. Yeah.
One thing that Reverend Matulski said, I was actually looking back at the video earlier today when we first had this conversation, is precisely what you're talking about, is that during the AIDS crisis, it kind of showed who was cared for and who was not cared for. And that he was waiting to see, and Reverend Matulski, you can correct me if I'm misrepresenting that, but I think you said that we could, as this progressed, we would see the population that was not cared for. We would see those who were lacking the care that was needed. And so it was interesting here in this week, particularly in the United States, we saw the disproportionate impact that it does have on people of color and particularly African Americans. One thing that Dr. Anthony Fauci said that I wanted to really ask this panel what you thought about this. If you didn't hear that, he said during that time, talking about the AIDS crisis, that there was an extraordinary stigma, particularly against the gay community. And it was only when the world realized how the gay community responded to its outbreak, or to this outbreak, with incredible courage and dignity, strength, and activism, that really changed the stigma against the gay community. And so, one, how does that make you feel when you lived through that? And to have that recognized now, 20, 30 years, 30-some years later. And how does that look today? How does that look today for us standing up for the rights of those who are disenfranchised and those who are disproportionately impacted by this disease because of the lack of care that's been there for them?
Well, I'll just add a little bit. I wasn't on the last call, obviously, but when thinking about these additional populations that we don't hear anything about, basically, is the incarcerated. I mean, They are absolutely sitting ducks. Where are they going to go? How do they do social distancing when you've got 8 men in a cell that was designed for 1, and they have deplorable medical conditions anyway? These, the doctors in a prison are not exactly the cream of the crop, and so these are just going to become killing fields. It's going to be like Cambodia, but they're going to be within the walls of a prison. I mean, the numbers could be astronomical.
Well, and we operate more than one kind of prison. We have prisons for profit, horrifying. We have prisons for that are run by the state. We have ICE, which is a remarkably unaccountable agency in terms of safeguards. And I do think that we have to pay attention. I mean, there are unique dimensions to the virus itself, but the civil liberties issues, I believe, are eerily the same. You know, who profits from this time of instability has to follow the money. You know, already I think it's becoming clear that the CARES Act's various provisions in it are inadequately funded, and it's hard to know what funding for that might look like anyway. But they were implemented without any kind of, or they were passed without any kind of implementation. So they're not even really available. And so they may become available. We hope so. But the fact that they're right now, you can't even apply for half of the things that are in it. Those could easily become forgotten. You know, I was a librarian. I took a time out of ministry in 1999, 2000. And I worked in my other profession at the San Francisco Public Library. And we were acutely aware after 9/11 of all the civil liberties infringements that were implemented through the Patriot Act, some of which still exist. And it became an opportunity for many curtailments that we have to pay attention to. You know, of course, we want to understand what public health, what's the best sense in public health. Well, public health is often, like religion, subjective and imperfect. It's no more morally driven or ethically driven in and of itself than any other institution, and has to be safeguarded. And we have to be involved in it, which we often are not, you know, especially as religious people. We tend to avoid that. And, you know, there will be opportunities. I mean, I have to believe that they're going to be real. We have to vote if we can. The census could become important in a new way. And so people have to fill it out, even though there was a conscious decision to not count LGBT people, you know, weirdly. But registering our needs will be one of the few strategies we have. I was struck by what you said, Nancy, that we can't gather. And it's true, it's frustrating, isn't it?
Yes.
But we did innovate new kinds of social protest during AIDS as we were going along. We didn't know that they would work. I mean, basically, ACT UP was a union for people who were sick and interacted with pharmaceutical and medical agencies in a way that previously they had to interact with them individually, right?
Did you see the body bags at Mar-a-Lago?
No.
There were people, activists went and put body bags all at the entryway to Mar-a-Lago.
Love it.
It was just like a flashback.
Yep. Well, some of the old things I think will work. And we probably don't even know yet what we're going to have to do. But we have to be paying attention to them as vigilantly as to all the medical information and all the other information flowing at us, because this is not something that we will be easily able to recover from. You know, this unfolded and is unfolding quickly, which is different from AIDS, which was a long, slow sort of nightmare. But the consequences of it, I think, will be similar. Everything is up for grabs. Everything. You know, I mean, we're religious people, so we're curious about what's going to happen to church. But really, I think everything is going to be up for grabs. And so it will not be the same. And it will happen more quickly, because things happen more quickly now, too. So, again, more vigilance, more participation.
Yeah, I wonder how ACT UP will act up when we can't gather, as Nancy was talking about. And you know, it may take the kind of risking of life to stage the kinds of protests that you were just talking about in Mar-a-Lago, where bodies were dumped in front of the entrance to the
It was body bags, not bodies.
Oh, body bags. Oh, okay. Yeah, well, still. I mean,
Yes,
people obviously had to be there to do that,
they did.
and social distancing probably was not a big factor on their minds
Right.
doing that.
But you're right, Steve.
Yeah. So what do we do to act up nowadays? How can we act up? And again, it may take the risking of the literal risk of life to act up in a way that will make a difference.
I think we have to pay attention to what is happening. What's currency going to be? Because that's what we were able to leverage, partly political and economic currency during AIDS in a way that no one had previously. So how is money going to change? And how will we somehow register not just dissent, but more than that, a commitment to really, while things are up for grabs, let's try and build things differently. Like, if we come out of this without universal health care, we're doomed. I mean, that we came out of AIDS without universal health care, God help me. I don't know how that happened, but it did. We were persuaded that it didn't matter. And it has been demonstrated. Universal health care, period. No compromising. Nothing less. No stupid insurance program. We've just got to hold firm, I think, to the things that we do know, while we discern what we don't know.
Yeah, I was very concerned that Bernie dropped out today, and one of his big issues was universal health care for all, and somehow the Democrats have to continue to carry that as an agenda item, a priority agenda item in the face of what we're going through now.
Yes. I'd like to speak to what activism might look like, because for the last 3+ years, I've been a full-time activist, and I've been arrested 6 times in Washington. I've been pulling together groups of activists. And I remember that during AIDS, people coalesced, the church and, SAGE and other gay and lesbian organizations and ACT UP coalesced to do some really powerful things. And this is a time where I'm seeing a lot of organizations, North Carolina organizations, national organizations, and global activist organizations coming together with remarkable agreement. And we have spent the last time, 3.5 years, getting to know each other. And, we've all come up with these local and national and global platforms that look almost identical. So I'm a little bit hopeful, because although all of that has to happen online right now, it is happening in I would say powerful ways. And it's become clear to me that this is not between Republicans and Democrats. This is between the earth and her people and corporations. That's who this fight is. That's who it is.
Karen, could you say a little bit more about what you see on a global level is happening?
Well, there are so many indigenous people fighting corporations for their land, and that's just everywhere. And groups like Extinction Rebellion standing with them, and I think that the water protectors, I think that more and more of us are opening our eyes to the climate crisis and how it's connected to absolutely everything else. And does the United States need 800 military bases and spend 53 cents of every dollar? That kind of thing. I think people are beginning to understand the connection between every single one of these issues that we've been powerfully, fiercely talking about for all these years. But now it's out in the open. These are apocalyptic times. It's becoming unveiled to everyone, that we have to have universal health care, that we have to stop killing the planet, that these indigenous people have been right all along. And so I think more and more powerful people are standing with the people who didn't have very much power, but were doing the right thing and saying the right thing and standing for the right stuff. Does that make sense?
Well, just as I think certain personal liberties were curtailed or after 9/11, the Earth's right to live, environmental policies right now could well be completely removed in the name of emergency. It's more important that we have this then that we pay attention to that, you know. And I know this from being an interim minister for several years now. You have to put into the DNA of what you are recreating any value or change that you hope will be manifest in the final product. So that churches that say, yeah, we'll deal with diversity after we found a pastor. This is a very frequent one. And not that they're opposed to it, but they just think, no, we've got to deal with certain, you know, survival aspects. The earth, the environment, civil liberties, immigration. I'm not worried that gay people will be stigmatized at all during this. I am worried that immigrants are already being stigmatized, and that it could get much worse before it gets better.
And Martin Luther King said, you know, racism is, end result is genocide. And we're seeing some very genocidal things right now.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And so that kind of leads us into, I gave Reverend Ziegler and Reverend Matulski a heads up that I would ask them this. One of the things that I often see or hear, and probably I should own that and say that I have felt this myself at times, and Reverend Kamendu is joining us from Kenya, so I'm glad he's able to.
Oh, cool.
Wonderful.
I think it's about 10 or 11 o'clock p.m. his time, so as soon as he gets in, we'll welcome him in. But one of the things I get quite frequently, I think this is probably a global thing, is why is it that we need to talk about politics in the middle of a crisis? You know, I see some of that now, but I think that just talking about politics in general turns a lot of people off because they're sick of, specifically in America, with the way our political system is really just the way it is. I'll leave it at that. And so it kind of turns people off. So why is it important? What would you say to people why is it so important for us to focus on that now and to hear some of these conversations? And what is it that you would say to them because the other side of it is, well, my one voice doesn't matter.
Right.
What I have to say.
I would say that, you know, politics is the allocation of scarce resources.
Mm-hmm.
And there's good politics and good policy, and policy matters. And politics is often the way you get policy, and you get that kind of change at that level of power. And so, you know, we can hide our heads in the sand or pretend and have our little religious, comfortable little club, or we can say that part of our social justice, our mandate, is to understand justice about the allocation of scarce resources, whose life matters, whose health matters. And there's bad and corrupt politics, and I think that turns people off. But the antidote to that is not to just walk away. It's to be engaged.
Well, I think we have bad and corrupt politics because too many people have been disengaged.
Right.
And I also disagree that we have scarce resources. We're the richest, just speaking for our country, the richest country in the world. There is no reason why anyone should be hungry or homeless or without a job. No reason at all. And to me, politics is about power. And if we're not paying attention to who has the power, then we're going to get killed every time.
Yes. Yeah.
Reverend Kamendu, if you can hear us, welcome to the call. I'm glad you were able to join us. Are you able to hear us?
Thank you, but can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
we can.
Yes.
I think it's good morning in your place, or is it, what time is it in your place?
It's 3:30 in the afternoon here where I'm at in North Carolina, but I believe it's still just afternoon over in California where some folks are at joining us. And Reverend Eggleston, what time is it where you're at? I don't have that one pulled up.
8:30 in the evening for me.
8:30. Okay.
Nice.
Thank you. Good afternoon, good evening.
Yes. Thank you for joining us. We're in the middle of talking a bit about how politics has played a role in our disenfranchisement and the way that the present COVID crisis has disproportionately impacted people. And certainly, I think we all can agree that it played a role in the way that AIDS disproportionately impacted and stigmatized people back in the 80s. Do you want to share with us what that's been like there in Kenya for you?
I may not touch the political aspects because I think here we are very far from involvement as politicians. What I can say is going into the future, there is going to be a lot of challenges in Africa because of two things: our culture and religious practices. Culture because we are superstitious. Superstitious, saying that this is not for nothing. It has come from. We would say it has come from outside. We say it is a curse, or rather, it is witchcraft, or such that we want to blame a deity somewhere or another force somewhere. When it comes to Christianity, Christian approach in Africa, again, the line between Christianity and superstition is also very thin. Most of the Christians here are now saying that God is punishing us for some sin that we have done. And the religious leaders here are going to struggle with how to convince their followers that God is not punishing us in any way. This is just a disease like others. Probably we are yet to know where it has come from. So superstition and very low levels of commitment to the faithful gospel of Jesus Christ. And the other thing maybe is the expectation of miracles. People have started saying that they can heal the coronavirus through miracles and prayer. And this is very dangerous. So we are going to struggle to convince the people that science and trust in God are the way forward.
And it would help if you had politicians nationally and locally supporting that message.
Yeah, if we had politicians who would support, that could be very good. But our politicians will follow what the religious leaders are saying and what the cultural leaders are saying. Religious leaders are the ones who provide the voters. When it goes to election, our politicians go to the churches so that they can get followers.
Well,
So,
I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm saying our politicians.
Go ahead, Reverend Kamundo.
Ask, please go ahead.
I wanted to say that in terms of COVID-19 being, or coronavirus being a punishment from God, I think that we learned a lot about that kind of argument back in the early years of AIDS. And MCC as a denomination published a pamphlet called AIDS Isn't God's Judgment, or AIDS, Is It God's Judgment? And of course the answer was no. And we have a very firm commitment, I think, in the church to at least through the AIDS crisis, to help people understand that that AIDS is not a punishment, that God doesn't punish people with disease. And the theology behind that has to be confronted and addressed, I believe, in very concrete ways. And excuse me, sorry about that. Anyway, so AIDS is not God's punishment. Coronavirus is not God's punishment. And in terms of miracles, miracles do happen, but we can't always count on that happening or being a sign that God is letting up on us, or anything like that. So I hope that we can be of some help to you there in Kenya with facing that issue of punishment from God. I mean, we've done a lot of work on that.
I think this is the other area that we have to leverage as church people, though, too. There's politics, and then there's theology. It won't surprise me to see some resurgence of scary theologies around this, around religious people who will try to take advantage of promising cures in the name of miracles. I mean, already could we be more horrified by how religious people have been presented, as enemies of public health by still having church services, this is stuff we have got to, this is our wheelhouse. And I think there'll be a need for it. I've even been, I'll just raise this as a theological point, a little anxious about the more liberal environmentalist things that I tend to sympathize with, that are saying something like this: the earth is punishing us for how we have mistreated her, or this is our due consequence. This is a liberal position largely, but it reminds me of the kind of metaphysical stuff I didn't like during AIDS too. It's insidious. I don't think the earth punishes. I don't think the universe is trying to slow us down. This is me personally. I just think that whole line of, there could be valuable things we can change during this, but the earth is not punishing us. God is not punishing us. I don't believe, so, and I think that asserting that as a religious position could be valuable. Plus, we do believe in healing. As Christians, we believe in the resurrection of the dead, and the life to come, in the words of the creed. I think it's time to say this stuff right now, as well as other things that we believe about mortality, about end-of-life issues. I think are going to become very prominent, or could become very prominent. And I think that we somehow absented ourselves from some of those conversations last time around. I think that we could be more assertive about their religious positions around end-of-life issues that are not simply it's a sin to kill yourself, So I want to flag theology. This is what we do.
Yeah. Good.
Reverend South, you were the director for the AIDS International or AIDS National Interfaith Network. What work did y'all do during the AIDS crisis around this particular topic, if you did anything? I'm not familiar with what they did during the time, particularly surrounding that idea.
Thanks. A couple of points I wanted to get in. One was just to follow up with what Jim was saying. During the midst of the epidemic, I was talking with a CDC virologist, and it was an insight to me, because at that time, we were talking about the virus as the enemy. We talked about it like in terms of war, like with World War II. Like the virus is the enemy, we're going to fight the enemy, we're going to get weapons against the enemy, blah, blah, blah. And this doctor was reminding me and saying, a virus is a living organism. It's like a bumblebee. It just wants to be the best bumblebee it can be. And, in reality it is. And retroviruses are new on the planet, and there's going to be more of them. AIDS was like our introduction to retroviruses. This is a new retrovirus. And there's going to be new ones after this and after this and after this, because these things evolve, and they're part of nature, and they evolve. So there was that. Second, one point I did want to make, I know this is basically an MCC discussion, but as far as a response to the epidemic, I think it was terribly important that we tried from all the major denominations had already responded to HIV in one way or another. Some really courageously, like MCC. But the important thing, I think, and in this discussion moving forward, is that we should not ignore the fact that we should be doing these things interfaith, in terms of interfaith response. And that also automatically makes it global, and also helps us not get stuck in our own little theologies, whatever they are. And it helps us to model for other peoples, other groups, whatever, that's an interfaith aspect of it. And as far as the theology, yes, we came up with various, early on, as Stephen was talking about, various papers, white papers, theology papers, and one of the key ones was about God's punishment kind of thing. So yeah, that was very important. And it was important for people to hear that because remember, one of the biggest differences was in that day, our biggest enemy wasn't the virus. Our biggest enemy was the Christian right. They were putting us in the grave every time they opened their mouths. We were the enemy. And so we needed to have people of faith and also to have the main media and Congress and all those people understand that they were, when people would get up and say, the church says, and some right-wing idiot, we had to remind them that they were not the church and that there is religious expression of all kinds and there are people with other kinds of views that are a lot more humane than what a couple of right-wing, well, it wasn't a couple, it was a major issue of the right wing. And so at least we kind of don't have that. We just have these right-wing people doing these crazy things like mega churches, filling them up with people infecting their own people. But it's not, that is, thank God, that is not the same. We don't have the church itself is our major enemy.
Yeah. And I think that's something, we have certainly seen that during the AIDS crisis and in time since then. We had folks that from extremist standpoints that blamed groups of people or whole nations because of 9/11 here in America during Katrina in New Orleans. I heard more than one time in some popular televangelists that came out and said it was New Orleans sin that sent the hurricane through New Orleans. And during the wildfires down in Australia, we've heard similar things coming out. So I think it's really important that we find interfaith connections to be able to help people understand that that's not a punishment being delivered on them for something that they
Right. Well, when you see that religion, right-wing religion and Christianity being the handmaiden of the president and of the corruption, then it is this in some sense it is the same forces, second, third generations of this, and
Very much.
when it says whose lives matter, that's where the rubber hits the road. And here, people who are selling out, Christianity and everything, for a piece of a pie that they think they're getting, and selling their own people and their own, communities. And it's horrifying. And it totally reminds me of you even have Falwell still involved. I mean, it's
right.
Falwell Jr. Wow.
It's about Samaritan's Purse in the middle of
Yes. Yes.
I first saw those tents going up. I thought, oh, wonderful, this is great. And all of a sudden I saw that the second day that sign, Samaritan's Purse, I knew exactly what was going to happen. And
Oh, my. Oh.
Appalling. And we in the church are called to speak truth to power, whoever has that power.
Right.
We still have to confront that power, even if it is corrupt, and hope that the truth that we are speaking to power will somehow influence people, if not the power itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, yes, there's a sense of giving people a voice in all of this, isn't there? Because there were judgments around HIV and AIDS because of the manner in which the virus was transmitted, and people took views on people's behavior. And there's that sense of, if we can't gather, then what can we do? And I think it's very important to the whole notion of it being this global pandemic. So, what do we do to actually work across countries and across nationalities and different ways of being? The president of Belarus, is saying you can have yourself a sauna and a vodka, and the football is still going on because that seems like a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And so you're in countries where you have an autocrat, a dictator. How do we invest people in those situations, and what do we learn from them? Because when we live in a democracy, I think we perhaps think that we have more levers to pull or more places of influence. I think sometimes when we look at countries where there isn't a democracy, where people are more imaginative in how they protest and how they influence, like Reverend Peters just said, it's not that you're necessarily influencing the politicians, you're influencing the people. And think of the shifts that took place for communism to fall, for the Berlin Wall to come down. What are the things that we learn in those circumstances that can help us now as well?
It's also a time for us to kind of do an inventory of the relationships that we have and the relationships that we could develop. Because, as not only MCC is smallish, still has a powerful voice. TFAM, Yvette Flunder's group, this is a group we already have a relationship with, right? The Fellowship of Affirming Ministries. These are Black, Pentecostal, gay churches in the same places where many of our churches are. And when we look at what could we do together in certain instances, what could we leverage together? Our UCC friends, I'll make a pitch for, the disciples, I don't know, whoever, sometimes it's local, sometimes it's going to be different in different national settings, but we don't need to silo ourselves on this. This is a time for a coalition, not isolation.
Yes.
So I'm going to specifically say, if you're close to a TFAM church, reach out right now, if you're an MCC church.
Yes. Yep.
And that's, into, go ahead, Karen, I'm sorry.
I just want to welcome Reverend Gibbs.
I was going to
Yes.
say.
Thank you. Thank you. Had some trouble getting on. Welcome, everybody. Hello.
Thank you
Glad
for
to see
joining us. I know you were coming in on from another call, so thank you for doing that.
Absolutely. The other call I was on was, what do we do in the face of, I work with people who are living with HIV and COVID, and we're trying to find out if there's some parallel between our HIV brothers and sisters who are succumbing to COVID and their HIV status. And we have researchers who are looking at that and seeing if there are any correlations there. And so far, researchers are still in the early stages of development of seeing if there are any direct correlations between HIV and whether or not COVID has any direct bearing on that. So we're doing now, but it's for those who are HIV positive and are succumbing to the illness as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I had a friend talk this morning at something else I was attending about how a friend of his who is HIV positive just died of COVID yesterday, and how somehow this rumor has gone about that the antiretroviral medications we're taking are going to protect those of us who are HIV positive from COVID, and it's just not true. People with HIV are getting COVID and they are dying from it.
Right. That's what they're seeing so far. It does have a direct impact, and that's what we're seeing so far. Yes.
I just wanted to suggest a resource as a plug for my own organization, but the American Academy of HIV Medicine is doing a lot of work in this area right now, and they're putting out papers almost daily. And so I would check out their website if you haven't already, because they are very much looking at exactly what you're talking about. It's American Academy of HIV Medicine.
Yeah, we'll get that link put up on the attached with this webinar as well. Reverend South, thank you for sharing that. So we're coming up in just a little bit on an hour, so we trying to keep these to close to an hour as possible, so that we are respectful of everyone's time. I know all of you are very busy during this time. What would you say? One of the next conversations we'll have is talking about what impacts we're going to see in the days coming and months coming in the future But for what challenges we face today and what we see today, what are the most pressing things that you see that pastors, that leaders, that churches need to be doing? One, on a local level, so what does each local church need to be doing? And then what do we need to be doing on a global level? In addition, maybe to some of the things we've already mentioned here this afternoon.
I know you referenced this last time, Vance. Those churches of ours that actually have a community program, Reverend Elder Pat Baumgardner was saying that they've had a 400% increase in the number of people that are using their food pantry. And I know that where
as well.
Yeah, and I know that where you are at St. John's, that other organisations have stopped running their food pantry and they've been donating food to you, and you're keeping it open. So I think there's a challenge for us in how we manage that and how we really make sure that our churches are very well educated and resourced on keeping the people safe while we continue to serve in that manner.
And how MCC churches could support the churches that are doing the most on the front lines would be really a wonderful, helpful thing, just for all of us to be more educated about who's doing what and who could we help immediately. I think as a local church pastor, just whatever relationships you have with churches or pastors, as Jim was saying earlier, TFAM, UCC, Unitarian, whatever, lean into those relationships. I feel like as important as the work I do to connect my own congregation with ourselves, but really it's the wider connections we have that are going to lift all of us.
I'd like to put in a plug too for Ministry of Presence in terms of how do we minister to all these people who are dying alone, whose family can't even get in to be with them. What does it mean for us to bring pastoral care and counseling to people who are in isolation because they need to be in isolation? How can we be that God with us, that Emmanuel, to people who are that isolated, not only in hospitals, but at home? You know, people who are sick with COVID at home are also terribly isolated. And I know people will drop food at their gate and run, you know, and how do we confront that kind of fear? I think those are all questions that we need to be addressing in the church.
I want to put in a pitch to pastors to, even though we're right in the middle of it, do Good Friday in some way or other, intentional space to lament, and let it be sad, let it be dire, let it be all the things that Good Friday was, and let Easter be Easter, also. Don't be afraid of it. Don't be afraid to say Jesus Christ is risen today, and parts of the cross, the grave, the skies, all that stuff. We believe that. It doesn't mean we're ignoring what's happening, but this is a time to say there are cycles, there is suffering, and there is resurrection. Not in an insensitive way, but to really proclaim this. We really do believe that things get better. This is our unrelenting, faith. I've become a little more orthodox in my later years, which is a little disturbing to me. But I do think that certain things have proven tried and true. The Eucharist. I'll say one more thing. If you're doing online services, include it every time. There's a whole tradition of, I'll post it in the notes by Alphonse de Ligori about spiritual communion. It has healing powers, I believe. Not superstition, but it's reminding us that the body's good. The body's not the enemy right now. Okay.
That's right.
So these things that are part of who we are, bring them to the forefront. And we have 6 weeks of Easter, and we do it as an annual event. There are certain things about the rhythm of our spiritual lives that I think we can offer.
That's so great. And I also think people look to pastors as examples. Like as long as we remain upright and rooted in our own faith, we can really help congregations walk through this death. It means being really brave about facing our own death, of course. But I just want to put in a plug for vulnerability. Like you started this, Vance, talking about like some pastors have never led a church through crisis and don't know how to do it. Well, let me tell you, I never knew how to even be a pastor, let alone lead a church through crisis. But my power was made perfect through weakness.
Amen.
And I knew that I couldn't do it. And so I had to really lean on my faith and especially all the people around me. So that I think that my greatest gift was recognizing how really I didn't know how to do anything. And the people around me and, the Holy Spirit informed me every step of the way.
Amen. Amen.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to make mistakes, because that is unfortunately the best way we learn. And we make a lot of them, but do something. And I appreciate that so much, Karen, what you just shared. Thank you.
We can really model that. I mean, I was looking back at my sermons from the 80s, horrifying, and someone recorded them so that I have recordings of them, even more horrifying. But we at one point we had a strong "do not take the HIV test" line, a political line, right? And we had our reasons for it. We were wrong, basically. It has to be okay to revise our opinions and model that for people too. Okay, this is what we said, but now this is no longer true. We may have to do something else. Also preserve the fabric of community as best you can. I pastor a small church of mostly senior citizens, older than me. And we've been using the internet to be in closer contact now than the church has been for 50 years of its existence.
Wow.
And I was the elder for New Orleans after Katrina. And one of the hardest, most sad things about that was they lost their building, of course, or their meeting space. But more than that, they lost touch with each other. They didn't even know what happened to each other. And it was a church that did not, in one way, survive Katrina. Something else is there that's, in its lineage. But we can't let, no matter what happens, keep connected. Make sure people know, where you are and what's happening to you. These are things the church is uniquely suited to do.
May I come in? May I come in?
Yes.
Yes.
Please.
This is Michael Kimindu from Kenya, Mutito Andei, Neema Metropolitan Community Church. I would like to say a bit of what we are doing at this moment. We do not have patients around us, but we have people who are keeping home because we have been told we cannot go outside our homes. And we are providing water for people to wash hands in their homes. They come and get water from us for free. Our 4-year-old daughter has donated 2 dresses to one of the small children of our age around. What we are seeing happening to us in the future is that although our national population is 47 million people, the present number of people infected by the virus today is 179, and the number is skyrocketing because our testing is very low up to now. And what we are seeing that is going to happen in the future is that we are going to have a lot of people, not necessarily sick, but people who are needing support in the community. People who are going to run out of resources like food. People will not be able to get stuff like sanitation because the availability is very low here. We are expecting these things to come from overseas. At the moment, people are trying to patch up clothes for masks. So there's going to be a lot of need for especially food support for the community, even before we get to the patient. So if the item you are touching when you are starting, the politics and the resources, we might, those of us who are in Africa might need someone to come to our aid, like they were calling for help from Macedonia in the early church. So don't forget about Africa, and Africa is not just Kenya, it's a big continent, and it has a lot of challenges. So we look for support from our brothers and sisters outside Africa.
I also wonder, Reverend Kimundu, is what the impact will be in terms of generations, because certainly in the UK, the science that's being put forward is that children are less vulnerable to the virus. So if you have adults who are HIV positive, affected or in AIDS, then if they're more susceptible to succumbing to the virus, then you may well have this whole thing of children being left as orphans or being vulnerable. And the population in many African countries is young because of that, because generations just got completely wiped out. So in terms of how that might change the demographics, again, there'll be certain countries where I think that might also be an impact.
In fact, from the report we received today from the Ministry of Health, they said the biggest number of the people who have been infected out of the 179, 3/4 are young people between 50 and 14. And this is because most of the infections are in the towns, and most of our young people live in the towns. There's a lot of rural to urban migration. So in the future, we are going to deal with a bigger population that will be probably...
I can't get off this. I can't get off this. How do I get off?
Bye, Nancy.
Hey, do you need to? And so, we are just after an hour here. Reverend Peters, if you're okay, I want to put you on the spot for just a moment as we get ready to wrap up. When we spoke last, you shared with us a bit of your story and your journey, and you shared with us something that I thought was appropriate this week to maybe let you shine some light on. We find ourselves in the midst of Holy Week and journeying through to the cross, and as we talked about on the call, and I've reminded our folks here that we are a resurrection people. So as we journey through the cross and to the tomb, we also are reminded of resurrection morning. You shared with us that shortly after you were diagnosed with AIDS, that you were called on to preach the Easter sermon. And so I wanted to give you a moment, if you would, to share with us a little bit about what that was like for you personally, if you will, and then what you would have us hear today as we approach Easter.
Wow. Well, I was diagnosed as terminal 2 weeks before Easter, and with lymphoma. And so it was really important for me to preach Easter, which was a great gift that Reverend Elder Ken Martin gave me that year. And so in looking at what it meant to believe in the death of Jesus on the cross and the resurrection, first of all, it meant that Jesus knew exactly what suffering was about. And that was so important to me, to know that, God was with me in my suffering, in the sickness, in the actual experience of illness. But then beyond that, Easter meant that if, to me, that God is greater than the death of Jesus on the cross. And so God is greater than AIDS, and God is greater than COVID-19. And God gives us everything we need, I believe, in our resurrection faith to be fully alive, even in the face of illness and death. That we can be, we can still dance, we can still laugh, we can still be politically active, we can still seek justice, we can still do everything that we are called to do, even when we are facing death, as we are now. So the resurrection is all about hope. And I think that it is particularly important in these days where so many people feel hopeless, that we preach hope, that there is hope, and hope comes from action, from being fully active and alive, even in the face of COVID-19.
Amen.
Thank you.
Amen.
And sorry to put you on the spot like that, but I really appreciate that.
I've been rehearsing it for 35 years.
Any other last remarks before we close out, or any other things that you would want people to hear? Well, thank you. Oh, go ahead.
Yes, I would like to say that in the future, we are also likely to face stigma, especially in Africa. People who have been diagnosed with the virus are being treated with a lot of scorn. People don't want to know who you are. I'm sorry, people want to know who you are so that they can keep away from you. So that's something we are going to struggle with in Africa in the near future. And so just as we have been struggling with HIV and AIDS, that might be another challenge for us in Africa. So I think we shall need a lot of support in fighting that kind of stigma for our people who may be infected. Let me also say that although we do not have a person infected in our home here, we have relatives who live in the US, and one of them is admitted they live in New Jersey, and she has been diagnosed with the coronavirus, and she's in a ventilator. So she's getting support from a ventilator. So as you pray for others, remember my cousin's wife in New Jersey.
Yes, we will certainly be praying. Reverend Commendu, thank you for sharing that, and we'll certainly be praying. And let us know if there's anything else we can do here. I know we've got folks in New Jersey. If there's anything that we can do, I don't want to volunteer their help, but I'm sure that they'd be willing to help do whatever we can to be there for your relatives and help you as much as we can. David Williams. Yeah, Reverend Commendu, Pastor David Williams, who's also a doctor in New Jersey and one of the chief medical doctors there, is asking what hospital they are in. If you don't mind telling us that, or if you want to share that offline, you can certainly let us know that, and we'll get that over to Dr. David Williams.
Yeah, I think if I couldn't get his contact, then I can ask my cousin where they are, so that I can give the information to the doctor.
Yeah, after this call, I'll get you and Dr. Williams connected so that y'all can do that.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Yes, thank you. Well, thank y'all again so very much for taking part in this conversation.
Thank you, Vance, for organizing it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a blessing to have all of you here and to hear the stories and to gain the experience or expertise that you all have. And so thank you. You are all a comfort and giving me certainly inspiration as we make it through this. So we really appreciate that. Thank you. God bless you. And and God keep you, and we'll be getting back together soon. Let us know if we
Thank
can.
you.
Have a blessed
Thank you,
Easter, everyone.
Yes.
Happy Holy Week.
Yes. Blessings,
Thank you,
everyone.
Leonard. Thank
Blessings.
you so much. Thank you so much.
And
Been a blessing.
Blessings.
Thank you.
good to see you, Karen.
Good to see you, Steve.